Let me say just a word then in closing about the nature of the letter and come back to our earlier point of Ephesians being a circular letter. One of the things to remember here is that the just making of written materials in the ancient world, the production of a letter, was a very expensive thing. The manuscripts that they would be written on were expensive. To use a scribe to write the letter would have been expensive. They had no copy machines, no ability to scan and send in PDF files. So the single copy that Paul sends would have been valuable and would have been easier probably to pass it around from house church to house church and maybe from city to city than to make copies of it. And in addition to that, most of the people in the ancient world couldn't read. Some could, but not a lot. So these letters would be read out loud publicly in the church. So there is a textual issue mentioned in the books that the words in Ephesus in chapter 1, verse 1 are missing in some of the oldest and the best manuscripts. This has led many to develop theories about the original intended audience for the letter. And one theory is that it was originally a circular letter, what's sometimes called an encyclical, intended for many churches. And here's one way this theory goes. As mentioned, there is an obvious connection between Ephesians and Colossians, and also between Colossians and Philemon. Now we know the occasion of Philemon. It is the letter is occasioned by Paul's meeting of a runaway slave named Onesimus in Rome. We don't know the circumstances, but it may be that Onesimus made his way to Rome, was in dire straits, and sought out Paul, who he had met before at the home of his master, Philemon. So as it happens, Paul sends a personal letter to the owner of Onesimus, that is Philemon. And Paul pleads for Philemon to accept Onesimus back into his household. And remember, he could have been executed or punished severely or perhaps sold. Paul seems to know Philemon personally, and he implies that he has stayed in his home before. The letter is addressed to Philemon and to the church that meets in your home. Along with this appeal for Onesimus, Paul sends a letter to the church in Colossae. This is the theory. These two letters go together. And this is probably the home church of Philemon. In other words, Philemon has a church that meets in his home. This is probably in the city that we know of as Colossae. This letter has many things in it, but it does give very specific regulations about the fair and humane treatments of slaves. This is in Colossians chapter 4. And that would serve the purpose of putting some peer pressure on Philemon to show a certain degree of leniency to Onesimus. One of the issues even in Ephesians is how do slaves and slave owners treat each other as Christian brothers. So the theory would say that along with these two letters, Paul writes a third, broader letter that was to circulate among the churches in the range of Ephesus. This would have included Colossae and Laodicea, which are both mentioned, or Laodicea mentioned in Colossians chapter 4, as well as Ephesus. So this third, much broader letter did not contain personal greetings because it was for several different churches. It does, however, give even more specific instructions about the fair and humane treatment of slaves. This is in Ephesians chapter 6. And this would mean that Paul's appeal to Philemon was repeated twice in these two other letters. Now, I don't know if this theory is true, but it's rather intriguing. And a further intriguing aspect to this theory is our knowledge that there was a bishop in Ephesus about AD 90 or so, maybe AD 100, and his name was in fact Onesimus. And we wonder, was this the former slave, Onesimus? If so, it would help explain why these letters were preserved, especially the little book of Philemon. I mean, one of the questions, why did Philemon ever end up being in the Bible, preserved in the canon? probably somebody had a personal interest there, and if this was Onesimus, who later becomes a very important person in the church in Ephesus, that may explain this. Going along with this is that many scholars believe that the Ephesian church was instrumental in collecting Paul's letters. There's some evidence that the earliest collection of New Testament writings may have originated in Ephesus, and that they contained the Gospel of Luke, the book of Acts, and a collection of 10 letters of Paul. And later this was expanded to include a number of other letters and Gospels. So we might look at that idea of Philemon, Colossians, and Ephesians graphically to look something like this expanding circle of influence.
Created using Powtoon.